If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. Today's story involves a man who did everything right. He was prepared, he was experienced, and he knew the rules of the wild. But as he was about to find out, the wilderness has its own set of rules, and those rules do not care about your experience or your gear. The date was November 3rd, 2025. The place was the high country of the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Bitterroot is about as rugged as it gets. It is over 1.5 million acres of jagged granite peaks, deep canyons, and timber so thick you can't see 5 feet in front of your face. It is a place where people go to get lost, and unfortunately, a place where many stay lost forever. A 38-year-old man named Caleb Ross was what you would call an elite survivalist. We are not talking about a weekend warrior who bought some gear at a big box store because he watched a reality show. Caleb was a guy who would disappear into the mountains for weeks with nothing but a fixed blade knife, a ferro rod, and a wool blanket. He had navigated the swamps of Florida and survived the biting cold of the Alaskan interior. He was the kind of person who felt more at home in the woods than in a grocery store. At exactly 10:15 a.m., Caleb stepped off the marked trail near Trapper Peak. His plan was a 3-day solo cross-country trek. He wanted to test his ability to navigate without a GPS, relying only on a topographical map and his silver pocket compass. He wanted to feel that raw connection to the earth that only comes when you are truly isolated. The first few hours were perfect. The Montana air was crisp, the larch trees were a brilliant gold, and the only sound was the rhythmic crunch of frozen pine needles under his boots. Caleb was in his element. He felt invincible. But at exactly 4:44 p.m., as the sun began to slide behind the sharp ridges, the vibe of the forest shifted. It was like someone had flipped a switch from peaceful to predatory. Caleb stepped into a small, circular clearing. In the center of this clearing were 3 deer. Now, seeing deer in Montana is about as common as seeing a car in a parking lot. But these deer were wrong. They were standing in a perfect equilateral triangle, facing inward toward each other. Their heads were bowed low, their noses almost touching at a single point on the ground. They were completely motionless. Caleb stopped. He waited for them to bolt, for them to catch his scent. But they did not move. No ear flick, no tail twitch. They looked like taxidermy statues dropped into the middle of the wilderness. Caleb felt a wave of cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. He did not want to disturb whatever this was, so he backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off them, and took a long detour around the clearing. By 6:00 p.m., it was getting dark fast. Caleb found a suitable spot to hunker down under a massive rock overhang. He went through his routine, clearing the ground, gathering tinder, and striking a spark. But when he pulled out his silver pocket compass to check the wind direction for his fire, he saw something that made his stomach drop. The needle on his compass was not pointing north. It was not pointing anywhere. It was spinning. It was not a frantic, wild spin, either. It was moving slowly and rhythmically, almost like it was pulsing to the beat of a heart. Caleb shook the compass, thinking maybe the hinge was stuck. He checked for any metal objects nearby. Nothing. He tried to ignore it and focused on his fire. But as the flames started to grow, the forest went dead silent. If you've ever spent time in the woods, you know there is always a sound. A breeze in the needles, a distant owl, a cricket. But this was absolute, heavy silence. The kind of silence that feels like someone has placed their hands over your ears. Then, the whispering started. It did not come from the bushes. It sounded like it was coming from inside his own backpack, which was sitting 3 feet away from him. It was a wet, muttering sound, like someone trying to speak with a mouthful of pebbles. Caleb's hand went to his hatchet. He slowly reached out and unzipped the main compartment. Inside, sitting right on top of his spare socks, was a small, hand-carved wooden doll. Caleb felt his breath hitch. He had never seen this thing in his life. It was about 6 inches tall, and it was carved with terrifying detail. It had his beard, it had his red outdoor jacket, it even had the small, jagged scar over his left eye from a childhood accident. And as he watched it in the flickering firelight, the doll's mouth was moving. Caleb did not scream. He was too deep in shock for that. He scrambled backward, kicking the backpack away. "Who is out there?" he shouted. His voice echoed off the rock overhang, sounding thin and fragile against the vast Montana night. The only response was a whistle. It was a 3-note whistle. High, low, then high Kimbali. Caleb's blood turned to ice. That was the exact signal he used to call his hunting dogs back at his ranch. It was private. It was specific. And someone, or Sesuatu, was using it against him in the middle of 1,000,000 acres of wilderness. At 2:22 a.m., Caleb woke up from a fitful sleep. His fire was out. Not just died down, but smothered. It looked like someone had poured a bucket of liquid ice over the coals. He reached for his flashlight, but when he clicked it on, the beam acted strangely. The light traveled about 3 feet and then just stopped, as if it was hitting a wall of solid black velvet. Within that tiny circle of light, he saw something that made his brain stall. Sitting 5 feet away from him were his boots, his heavy, leather hiking boots. They were standing upright, pointing directly at him. Caleb looked down at his own feet. He was barefoot. He had no memory of taking his boots off. He had no memory of placing them there. He looked at the boots again and realized they were not just his boots, they were newer times than his. The scuffs he had earned in Alaska were gone. They were perfect. He realized then that he was not just being hunted, he was being unmade. Piece by piece, the forest was taking his things and replacing them with versions that did not belong to him. He grabbed his wool blanket and his hatchet and started running. He did not care about navigation anymore. He just needed to move. But no matter which way he turned, no matter how many ridges he climbed or canyons he descended, he kept ending up back at the same rock overhang. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. The 3rd time he arrived back at the camp, he saw his own backpack. But it was not his backpack. It was made of a material that looked like woven human hair. He did not open it. He just kept running. At 4:30 a.m., Caleb collapsed against a tree, his feet bleeding and his lungs burning. The 3-note whistle started again. This time, it was not coming from the distance. It was coming from right above him. He looked up into the branches of a massive ponderosa pine. Perched there, looking down at him, were the 3 deer from the clearing. They were crouching on the limbs like giant, gangly birds, their long legs folded in ways that should have been physically impossible. Their black, glassy eyes reflected the moonlight in a way that looked like static on a television screen. One of the deer opened its mouth. It did not make a sound like an animal. It spoke, and it spoke in Caleb's own voice. It said, "The rule of 3, Caleb. 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 steps until you belong to the forest." Caleb felt a sensation of something pulling at his skin. He looked at his hand, and for a split second, his fingers looked like they were made of wood. He was not just being hunted, he was being harvested. Caleb did not wait to hear more. He knew he was losing his mind or losing his soul, and he did not care which. He grabbed his emergency fuel canister, a small bottle of white gas, and poured it over a pile of dry brush. He struck his ferro rod with everything he had left. The explosion of orange flame ripped through that unnatural, inky darkness. For a split second, the world snapped back into focus. The deer were gone. The whispering stopped. The forest felt like a forest again. Caleb saw a gap in the trees that looked like a real path, and he ran. He ran until his heart felt like it was going to burst through his ribs. He did not stop until he felt the hard, cold sensation of asphalt under his feet. He had reached a Forest Service road. It was 7:15 a.m. He found his truck exactly where he had left it. He dove into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and drove until he saw a ranger station. He did not go inside to tell a story about monsters. He was a survivalist. He knew people would think he had a psychotic break from the isolation. He just grabbed the radio and called 911. When the authorities arrived, they found Caleb shivering in the back of his truck. He had mild hypothermia and some nasty cuts on his feet, but he was alive. One of the deputies, a guy named Miller who had known Caleb for years, walked up to him to give him a blanket. Miller paused and looked at Caleb's red jacket. "Hey, Caleb," he said, sounding confused. "When did you get the custom stitching done?" Caleb looked down. On the left breast of his jacket, where there used to be a professional brand logo, there were now words stitched into the fabric in thick, black thread. It was in Caleb's own handwriting. It read, "Asterisk, property of none, asterisk." Caleb did not say a word. He went home. He sold his ranch, and he moved to a high-rise apartment in the middle of a concrete city where he could not see a single tree from his window. He stayed away from anything green. But here's the part that keeps Caleb up at night. A few days after he got back, he was taking a shower and he looked in the bathroom mirror. The small, jagged scar over his left eye, the one he had carried since he was 10 years old, was gone. His skin was perfectly smooth, like a new piece of furniture. And when he finally got the courage to open his old hiking backpack to throw it away, he found something in the bottom. The wooden doll was gone. In its place were Tiga gold larch needles, laid out on the nylon fabric in a perfect, equilateral triangle. Caleb Ross never went back to the mountains, because he knows that out there, in the deep timber, you are not an elite survivalist. You are just a temporary occupant, and eventually, the host is going to want its house back. If you ever find yourself in the Bitterroot National Forest and the wind dies down, and you hear a 3-note whistle, do not whistle back. Just keep walking, because once they have your voice, they are coming for the rest of you. And the scary part is, you might not even realize you have been replaced until you look in the mirror and see a stranger's face with your own eyes. Now, you might think that was the end of the story, but about 2 weeks after Caleb Ross fled the Bitterroot, a team of Forest Service rangers went back to the area near Trapper Peak. They were looking for any signs of illegal camps or environmental damage. They found the rock overhang where Caleb had stayed. The charcoal from his fire was still there, but they found something else that was not in Caleb's report. Buried under about 6 inches of pine needles, directly beneath where Caleb had laid his wool blanket, they found a set of 3 silver pocket compasses. All 3 of them were exactly like the one Caleb owned, and all 3 of them were fused together in a melted clump of metal, despite there being no sign of a fire hot enough to melt silver. The lead ranger, a veteran with 20 years of experience, also reported finding a circle of trees about a mile away. These trees, all ponderosa pines, had grown in such a way that their branches had intertwined to form a perfect dome over a small patch of ground. Inside that dome, the ground was perfectly flat and covered in a layer of fine gray dust. Analysis of the dust later revealed it was composed of organic matter, mostly skin cells and hair, all belonging to the same individual. The DNA matched Caleb Ross, but when the rangers looked at the dates, they realized the dust had been there for decades. It was as if Caleb had been unmade in that forest long before he ever stepped foot in it on November 3rd. The Forest Service officially closed the case as unexplained phenomenon, a common label for the thousands of disappearances that happen in the American National Park System every year. But the rangers who were there that day, they don't go back to Trapper Peak. They know that some places on this earth are not meant for us. They are pockets of something older, something that operates on a logic we can never understand. So, if you are planning a hiking trip this weekend, do yourself a favor. Stay on the trail. Keep your GPS on. And if you see 3 deer standing in a triangle, don't stop to take a photo. Just turn around and go home. Because the forest is always watching, and it has a very long memory. And it is always looking for new pieces to add to its collection. This story serves as a reminder of the missing 411 phenomenon that has gripped the Pacific Northwest for years. People disappear in the woods under impossible circumstances, sometimes found miles away in areas they couldn't possibly have reached, or sometimes never found at all. Caleb Ross was one of the lucky ones. He got out. But did he really? If his scar is gone, and his jacket is changed, who exactly is sitting in that high-rise apartment in the Midwest? We may never know. But the next time you are in the woods, and you feel that sudden, heavy silence, just remember Caleb, and remember the rule of Tiga. 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, and 3 steps until you are gone. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe for more strange, dark, and mysterious content. We post stories like this every week. Until next time, stay safe out there. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. Today's final story is the one that brings everything together. It is about a boundary, not a boundary on a map, and not a fence made of wire, but a boundary of reality itself. It is a story about a man who found a hole in the world, and once he looked inside, he realized the world had been looking at him his entire life. The date was December 12th, 2025. The place was the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Gila is one of the most desolate, ancient, and unforgiving places in the lower 48 states. It is over 500,000 acres of black canyons, volcanic rock, and ancient cliff dwellings left behind by people who vanished centuries ago. It is a place where the silence is so heavy it actually has a tactile weight to it. A 55-year-old man named Elias Vance was a high-altitude surveyor. He was a man of precision, a man who lived his life by the millimeter. His job was to map anomalies in the terrain, basically. He went to the places that satellites couldn't quite see because of shadows, mineral deposits, or magnetic interference. Elias was a man of cold logic. He didn't believe in ghosts, and he certainly didn't believe in the local legends of the skinwalkers or the shimmering people that the locals whispered about in the diners of Silver City. To him, the world was a grid, and every grid had a coordinate that could be measured, categorized, and conquered. At exactly 8:15 a.m., Elias was hiking near the Mogollon Mountains, carrying a laser rangefinder worth $20,000. He pointed it at a massive canyon wall about 500 yards away to establish a baseline. The digital display should have flashed 500 meters. Instead, the screen flickered and read 0. He frowned, wiped the lens, recalibrated the device, and tried again. 0. He pointed it at a pine tree 3 feet away. 3 meters. He pointed it back at the distant, towering canyon wall. 0. It was as if, according to the physics of light and reflection, that massive wall of rock was standing right in front of his eyeballs. It was as if there was no space between him and the horizon. Elias, being a man of science, assumed it was a hardware malfunction caused by the solar flares reported that morning. He decided he had to investigate the rock face physically. He began to hike toward the canyon, but as he walked, the world began to lag. He would take 10 steps forward, but when he looked back at the tree he had just passed, it was 50 yards away. He was moving through space at a speed that defied human biology. The clouds above him weren't drifting. They were snapping from one position to another, like frames being skipped in a corrupted video file. At exactly 11:45 a.m., Elias reached the base of the canyon wall, but as he got closer, his brain began to reject what his eyes were seeing. It wasn't rock. It wasn't basalt or granite. The wall was a vertical, vibrating surface of what looked like liquid mercury. It was perfectly smooth, reflecting the desert sky, but the reflection was wrong. In the mercury wall, the sun wasn't yellow, it was a deep, pulsing emerald green. The trees in the reflection had blue leaves, and the mountains behind him were shaped like perfect, geometric pyramids. Elias reached out a gloved hand, his curiosity overriding his survival instinct. He expected to touch cold, hard stone or wet liquid, but his hand didn't hit a surface. It just disappeared. He felt a sensation of pins and needles, like his arm had fallen asleep, but 1,000 times more intense. He pulled his hand back, and his heavy-duty work glove was gone. Not torn, not cut, just erased. Where his hand should have been, his skin was now covered in a layer of shifting, iridescent scales that looked like a bird's wing. He didn't feel pain. He felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of clarity. He felt like he could see the code behind the air. At exactly 1:20 p.m., Elias noticed something moving inside the mercury wall. A figure was walking toward him from the other side. It was a man. As the figure got closer, Elias realized the man was wearing a surveyor's uniform identical to his own. He was carrying the same laser rangefinder. He had the same gray stubble, the same tired eyes, and the same small scar on his chin from a childhood fall. The man on the other side stopped and looked at Elias. But he didn't look scared. He looked disappointed, like a baker looking at a burnt loaf of bread. The double reached out and touched the surface of the wall from the other side. When his hand passed through the silver film, it came out looking exactly like Elias's original hand, with the glove still on. The two men were standing inches apart, separated by a thin, vibrating membrane of elsewhere. "You weren't supposed to find the seam," the double said. His voice didn't come from his mouth. It came from the speakers of the rangefinder hanging around Elias's neck. It was a synthesized, hollow version of his own voice. "The grid is being updated. You are part of the old version. You are redundant data." Elias tried to scream, but he realized his mouth was no longer there. His face was becoming smooth and featureless, like the surface of the mercury wall. He looked down at his body and saw that he was dissolving into a stream of silver numbers, geometric shapes, and lines of glowing green text. He wasn't dying. He was being recalculated. He was being moved to a different folder. At exactly 3:30 p.m., the emerald sun in the reflection began to set. The double, the new Elias, stepped through the wall, fully entering our world. He adjusted his hat, checked his rangefinder, which now read a perfect 500 meters, and began to walk back toward the trailhead with a confident, rhythmic stride. The real Elias, or what was left of his consciousness, was pulled into the mercury. He found himself standing in a version of the Gila wilderness that was made entirely of light, sound, and mathematics. There were no trees, only the times, frequency times of trees. There were no rocks, only the times vibration, times of minerals. He was in the source code. He looked up and saw the seam. It was a giant, glowing golden zipper that stretched across the entire sky, from horizon to horizon, and through the zipper he could see the world he had just left. It was like looking through a window into a house he no longer lived in. He saw his double reaching his truck. He saw his double driving back to the surveyor's office in Silver City. He saw his double walking into his home, hugging his wife, and eating a dinner of beef stew. And then, the horror truly set in. The double stopped eating, looked directly into the kitchen window as if looking through the seam, and straight at the real Elias trapped in the light, and he smiled. The double mouthed one word, archived. Elias Vance was never reported missing, He never became a statistic in a missing 411 book, because as far as the world, his family, and the government were concerned, Elias Vance never left. He returned from his trip, he finished his maps, and he lived another 30 years before dying peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by his grandchildren. But the surveyors who inherited Elias's old equipment years later noticed something strange. Every map Elias made after that trip in December 2025 was perfect. They were too perfect. There wasn't a single error, not a single smudge, and not a single missing coordinate in over 1,000 pages of data. But if you looked at those maps under a specific frequency of ultraviolet light, you could see something hidden in the margins, drawn in a substance that wasn't ink. There were thousands of tiny, hand-drawn symbols that looked like eyes, and every single eye was looking toward the center of the map, where a single coordinate was marked with a 0. If you ever find yourself in the Gila Wilderness, or the Smokies, or the Olympic Peninsula, and your GPS starts giving you impossible readings if it tells you that the mountain 10 miles away is actually 0 inches from your face, do not keep walking. If you see a wall of rock that looks a little too much like a mirror, or if the trees start to sound like your own mother calling your name, turn around. Do not try to touch your reflection, because the grid is always being updated. The universe is constantly cleaning its hard drive, and if the system finds 2 versions of the same file, it has to decide which one is the master and which one is the backup. There are places in this world where the render distance is short and the seams are thin. We call them national parks. We call them wilderness. We think we go there to find ourselves. But the things on the other side, they go there to find times us asterisk. To them, we aren't people. We are just data points. And sometimes, data needs to be refreshed. Elias Vance is still there, in the Gila. He isn't a man anymore. He is the sound of the wind through the canyons. He is the static on your radio. He is the reason your compass spins when it should be still. He is archived, waiting for the next update, waiting for the system to crash so he can finally step back through the seam. Until then, stay safe, stay on the grid, and whatever you do, do not look at the 0. Because once you see the hole in the world realizes there is a hole in you. Thank you for joining us for this marathon of the strange, dark, and mysterious. If you enjoyed these 5 stories, please hit the like button and subscribe. We post these journeys into the unknown every single week. Until next time, keep your signals strong and your eyes on the trail, because you never know when you might step off the map and into the bin. Good night. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. Today's story is about a group of friends who wanted to escape the noise of the digital world, only to find themselves trapped in a place where the laws of physics, the flow of time, and the very fabric of their existence had been moved to a trash folder. It is a story that will make you look at your cell phone signal bars in a completely different way. The date was August 19th, 2025. The place was a remote, unnamed valley tucked deep within the high Uintas wilderness in Utah. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Utah's backcountry, it is famous for its dead zones. These are vast, ancient stretches of land where the geography is so jagged and the minerals in the rocks are so dense that they swallow every radio wave, cell signal, and GPS ping that tries to enter. For most people, this is a nightmare. But for 24-year-old Elias Thorne and his 3 best friends, it was the holy grail of vacations. They called it the digital detox. The rules were ironclad. Leave the phones, the tablets, and the smartwatches locked in the safe of the truck at the trailhead. Take only analog gear, mechanical watches, film cameras, and paper maps. They were going to disappear into the pines for 72 hours to reset their brains from the constant dopamine loops of Silicon Valley. Elias was a high-level software developer from San Francisco. He spent 16 hours a day staring at lines of code, and he was starting to feel like he was becoming part of the machine. Joining him were Sarah, a trauma nurse who needed a break from the sirens, Marcus, a former collegiate athlete who lived for physical challenges, and Chloe, a freelance photographer who wanted to capture the world on actual 35mm film. At exactly 10:30 a.m., the group hiked past a rusted, bullet-riddled metal sign at the edge of the wilderness. It simply said, "End of Forest Service maintenance. No signal beyond this point. Travel at your own risk." They laughed, adjusted their heavy packs, and descended into the valley. But as they crossed the invisible threshold of the valley floor, the atmosphere didn't just change, it curdled. The air felt heavy and static, like the sensation you get in your teeth right before a massive lightning strike. The wind didn't rustle the leaves. It seemed to vibrate them. The shadows on the ground didn't look like shadows of trees. They looked like jagged, low-resolution black shapes that flickered whenever the group moved their eyes. At exactly 2:00 p.m., they reached a small creek and decided to check their location. Elias pulled out his high-end, military-grade analog compass, but when he opened the brass casing, he didn't see the needle pointing north. The needle was spinning. It was moving in a slow, rhythmic circle, exactly one rotation every 2 seconds. And every time that needle completed a full turn, Marcus, who was wearing a mechanical wind-up Hamilton watch, noticed something that made his blood run cold. The second hand on his watch would skip. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then it would jump back 3 seconds. Then it would freeze for 5. It was as if the gears of reality were slipping. Marcus showed the watch to Sarah, who tried to find a pulse on her own wrist. She looked at her mechanical stopwatch and realized her heart was beating 72 times a minute, but the watch said only 10 seconds had passed. "The gear is glitching," Chloe whispered. She tried to take a picture of the strange, distorted clouds above them, but every time she pressed the shutter, the mechanical parts inside her vintage camera made a sound like a garbage disposal grinding on a fork. When she pulled the film lever, it didn't stop. It kept winding and winding, as if the roll of film inside had become infinite. They decided right then and there to turn back. They were only 5 miles in. It should have been an easy hike out. But as they turned around, they saw that the trail they had just walked, the one they had spent 4 hours descending, was gone. In its place was a wall of flat, featureless gray fog. It didn't look like weather. It looked like a missing texture in a video game. It was a vertical wall of nothingness that stretched from the canyon floor to the sky. At 4:45 p.m., the sun began to set. But it didn't set in the west. It stayed exactly where it was in the sky, turning a deep, bruised shade of purple, and then it simply blinked out. 1 second there was light, and the next, the valley was plunged into a darkness so absolute that their flashlights seemed to struggle to even leave the lens. The beams of their lights didn't travel. They seemed to hit the darkness and bend, as if the air itself had become a physical obstacle. "Stay together," Elias whispered. His voice sounded strange, like it was being played through a low bitrate speaker. He reached out to grab Marcus's shoulder to keep the group tight, but his hand passed right through Marcus's jacket. Marcus didn't feel like a ghost. He felt solid to himself, but for a split second, Elias's hand looked like digital static, a jumble of flickering, translucent pixels that hummed with a low frequency. Then, the broadcast began. It wasn't a voice. It was a sound that came from the ground itself. It was the screeching, rhythmic pulse of an old dial-up modem, but amplified to a deafening volume. It echoed off the canyon walls, shaking the very stones beneath their feet. Suddenly, Chloe screamed and pointed her light at a nearby pine tree. Tucked into the bark of the tree, as if it had grown there like a fungus, was a smartphone. Elias recognized it instantly. It was his phone, the one he had locked in the truck's safe 5 miles away. The screen was cracked, but it was glowing with an unnatural blue intensity. It was playing a video on a loop. Elias walked over, his heart hammering against his ribs. The video showed the 4 of them standing in this exact spot, but they were older, much older. Sarah's hair was white and matted. Marcus was missing his left arm, the stump cauterized by something blue. They were sitting around a campfire that burned with a blue, cold flame that cast no shadows. The Elias in the video looked directly into the camera lens and spoke. His voice was a layered mess of thousands of different tones. "It is 8:12 p.m., the video Elias said. "We have been in the buffer for 19,000 days. If you are watching this, do not look at the moon. The moon is the eye of the compiler. If you look at it, you will be rendered." Everyone instinctively looked up. There was no moon. In its place was a giant, glowing white circle with a spinning, loading icon in the center, rotating slowly against the black sky. It was miles wide, pulsing with a pale light that made the trees below look like wireframe models. Panic, raw and primal, took over. Marcus, the athlete, couldn't take the sensory overload. The sound of the modem was drilling into his skull. He started running toward the gray fog, screaming for his mother, screaming for anyone. The others tried to catch him, but he was too fast. His movements were jagged, as if he were skipping frames in a movie. He disappeared into the mist at exactly 9:00 p.m. A second later, his voice boomed over an invisible speaker system that seemed to fill the entire valley. It was Marcus's voice, but it was coming from every direction at once. "Help! I found the exit!" "It is right." The voice didn't trail off. It shattered into a sharp burst of white noise. A sound so loud, it knocked Elias and the girls to the ground. Elias, Sarah, and Chloe huddled together under the rock overhang. They realized then that this valley wasn't a sanctuary. It was the recycle bin of the universe. This was where reality dumped the glitches, the people, the objects, and the moments that didn't fit the code of the world anymore. They looked around and saw that the pines were no longer pines. They were columns of green light, flickering between different shades of emerald and lime. At 3:00 a.m., the static sound finally stopped. The fog cleared for a moment, revealing the true nature of the valley. It wasn't full of trees anymore. It was a vast, endless field of rusted metal towers, thousands of them, reaching miles into the purple sky. Each tower was covered in thousands of tiny, glowing ports. And hanging from these towers, suspended by glowing red wires that entered the base of their skulls, were thousands of people. Their eyes were open. They were flickering with that same red light. They were being processed, their memories and their data being harvested to feed the world outside. Elias saw faces he recognized from missing persons posters he had seen in San Francisco years ago. Elias looked at his own hands. They were becoming transparent. He could see the rusted towers through his own skin. His blood vessels looked like fiber optic cables. "We have to leave," he said, his voice now sounding like a distorted robotic growl. "We have to force a reset. We are a script that has gone wrong. We need to crash the system." He remembered a theory he'd read about in graduate school about how systems react to a critical error. If a piece of data becomes too corrupted, the system tries to eject it before it infects the rest of the drive. He grabbed a high-intensity flare from his pack. He didn't aim it at the sky. He aimed it at the ground at the exact spot where the modem sound was loudest, where a cluster of blue wires was emerging from the dirt. "When I fire this, run toward the light. Do not look back, and do not think about anything but the parking lot," Elias yelled. He pulled the trigger. The flare hit the ground, but instead of an explosion of fire, it created a tear. It looked like a hole ripped in a photograph, showing the white paper underneath. Through the tear, Elias could see the trailhead parking lot. He could see the morning sun hitting the dust on his truck. He could see a ranger driving past in a green pickup. "Jump!" Sarah and Chloe dove into the tier. Elias followed, but as he moved, he felt something grab his ankle. He looked down and saw a hand made of static reaching out from the ground. It was Marcus. Or at least, it was what was left of Marcus's data. The thing that used to be Marcus tried to pull him back into the bin. Elias kicked it away, feeling a sensation like his entire body was being compressed through a needle. His vision turned into a sea of green code, then white, then nothing. He woke up on the gravel of the parking lot at exactly 10:30 a.m., the precise time they had originally arrived to start their hike. The mountain air was normal. His heart was beating at a normal rate. His friends were there, gasping, vomiting from the transition. Sarah was crying, clutching her own hair to make sure it was real. Chloe was shaking her camera, which was now empty of film. They were safe. The sun was warm. The birds were actually singing. The silence was just silence. But when Elias reached into his pocket to find his truck keys, he felt something else. He pulled it out. It was Marcus's Hamilton watch. The glass was shattered. The hands were spinning backwards so fast they were a blur, emitting a faint, high-pitched whine. And Marcus was gone. He wasn't in the truck. He wasn't on the trail. He wasn't in the bathroom, at the trailhead. Elias ran to the truck safe and ripped it open. His phone was there, exactly where he'd left it. It was cold to the touch. He turned it on and went to his photo gallery to show the police. But in every single photo from their childhood, from college, from the party last Christmas, and even from that morning, there were only 3 people: Sarah, Chloe, and Elias. There was always a gap, a space where a 4th person should have been standing. In their graduation photo, Sarah and Elias were holding hands with an invisible man. The space where Marcus should have been was just a blur of empty background. Marcus hadn't just died. He had been deleted from the history of the world. Even his parents, when Elias called them from the ranger station, didn't know who Marcus was. They told Elias he must be confused or stressed from work. They said they only had a daughter. The police took a report, but they treated it as a mental health crisis. They looked at the 3 of them like they were on drugs. How do you report a missing person who never existed? Elias Thorne never went back to the mountains. He quit his job in San Francisco. He moved into an apartment in the loudest, most electronically dense part of downtown Seattle, directly underneath a massive 5G cell tower. He keeps every light in his house on. He keeps 3 radios playing different stations at once. He has 4 different internet providers. He wants the noise. He wants the signal. He wants to be so deeply connected to the network that the universe can never mistake him for a glitch again. Because he knows that in the quiet places, where the bars on your phone drop to 0, the world stops being real. He knows that the wilderness isn't just nature, it's a gap in the coverage. And if you stay in those gaps too long, the compiler might just decide you are a piece of corrupted code that needs to be removed. If you ever find yourself on a trail and your watch starts to skip, or if you look up and the moon looks just a little too sharp, a little too white, don't wait for the sun to set. Run. Do not look back at the fog, because once you enter the sanctuary, there is no undo button. You won't just die. You will never have been born. The last thing Elias saw before he left the valley was his own name on a screen, highlighted in red, with a small cursor blinking next to it. The cursor was moving toward the backspace key. He doesn't sleep in the dark anymore, because every time he closes his eyes, he hears that dial-up modem sound, and he wonders if he's still in the truck, dreaming of a world that has already deleted him. Stay safe, keep your signal strong, and whatever you do, do not look at the loading icon in the sky. Thank you for listening. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. Because today's story is about a man whose job was to protect the wilderness, but he ended up needing protection from something the wilderness had created. It is a story that begins with a simple piece of plastic ribbon and ends with a discovery that defies every biological law we know. The date was October 14th, 2025. The place was the Olympic National Park in Washington State. Now, for those of you who have never been to the Olympic Peninsula, you need to understand the geography. It is home to one of the only temperate rainforests in the world. It is a place of ancient moss, towering Sitka spruces that are hundreds of years old, and a fog so thick it feels like you are walking through wet wool. It is a place where the ground is always soft, the air is always damp, and things have a habit of staying hidden under the giant ferns for a long, long time. A 42-year-old man named David Thorne was a senior park ranger with over 15 years of experience. David was not a novice. He was the kind of guy who knew every trail, every drainage, and every rocky outcropping in his sector. He was highly respected, incredibly fit, and he was the guy the younger rangers went to when they got turned around in the brush. He was not the type of man to get spooked by a strange noise or a trick of the light. At exactly **8:45 a.m. David was conducting a routine patrol near the Hoh River Trail. His task was simple: check for downed trees after a heavy windstorm that had ripped through the peninsula the night before. But as he reached a section of the forest that should have been as familiar to him as his own backyard, he noticed something that was not on any of his official maps. Branching off from the main trail, hidden behind a curtain of hanging club moss, was a narrow, perfectly cleared path that headed straight into the densest, most untraveled part of the forest. And marking this path, tied to a low-hanging hemlock branch, was a bright red plastic marker, the kind hikers or surveyors use to mark a temporary trail. David stopped. He pulled out his GPS unit. There was no official trail listed there. No maintenance requests, no research permits. He checked his radio, but all he got was a wall of static that sounded like someone frying bacon. He figured maybe a group of illegal campers or poachers had blazed their own trail, so he decided to follow it to make sure they weren't building illegal fires or littering. He walked for 20 minutes, following the red markers. Every 50 feet, like clockwork, there was another ribbon tied to a tree. But as he got deeper into the woods, David noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The forest was getting quieter. Not just nature quiet, but dead silent. The birds had stopped singing. The wind had stopped moving the canopy. Even the sound of his own heavy boots hitting the soft earth seemed to be swallowed up by the moss. At exactly **10:32 a.m., David reached for one of the red markers to tear it down. But as his fingers made contact with the material, he recoiled in pure, instinctual disgust. It wasn't plastic. It wasn't vinyl. It felt warm to the touch. It was slightly damp and had a texture that was strangely fibrous, like a strip of raw, sun-dried steak. David's heart began to pick up speed. He pulled out his pocket knife and sliced a small piece of the ribbon. Instead of shredding like plastic, the marker began to bleed. A thick, dark crimson fluid, almost black, oozed out of the cut, dripping slowly onto the mossy ground. David watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the liquid didn't just sit there. It seemed to be absorbed by the moss with a faint, slurping sound. He looked ahead and saw that the trail was changing. The markers weren't just tied to the trees anymore. The red material was now growing out of the bark itself, winding around the trunks like massive, pulsating veins. The further the trail went, the more it looked like the forest was being covered in a layer of living, breathing muscle. David decided right then that he had seen enough. He was a professional, and his gut was screaming at him to get out. He turned around to head back to the main Hoh River Trail, but when he turned, the path he had just walked was gone. In its place was a wall of thick, pulsating red vines that had grown across the gap in a matter of minutes. They were wet, slick, and moved with a slow, peristaltic motion, like an esophagus. He looked at his watch. It was asterisk 11:15 a.m., asterisk. He looked at his compass, but the needle was useless. It was pointing toward the center of the red trail, no matter which way he turned his body. He was being pulled inward. With no other choice, David kept moving forward, deeper into the core. As he walked, the ground beneath his boots started to feel soft, not like mud or peat, but like stepping on a mattress. Every time he took a step, the ground would groan, and a faint, rhythmic thumping could be felt through the thick soles of his boots. It was a vibration that traveled up his legs and settled in his chest. It was a heartbeat, a massive, subterranean heartbeat that seemed to encompass the entire valley. At asterisk 1:45 p.m. asterisk, David stumbled into a wide clearing. In the center of this clearing was a large, humped shape covered in a thick, matted layer of the red muscle fibers and gray lichen. As he got closer, his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. It was a vehicle. It was an old Forest Service truck, a 1991 Ford, its white paint barely visible under the red growth. He recognized the unit number on the door, 704. David's breath hitched. He knew that number. Unit 704 belonged to a ranger named Elias Vance. Elias had gone missing in this exact sector in October of asterisk 1994 for 30 years. The search for Elias Vance had been one of the biggest cold cases in Washington history. They had found nothing, no clothes, no truck, no tracks. The truck was suspended 3 feet off the ground by the red veins, which had grown through the windows, the tires, and the engine block, anchoring it like a fly in a spider's web. David forced the rusted door open. The interior of the truck didn't smell like rot. It smelled like ozone and iron. Sitting in the driver's seat was a figure. It wasn't a skeleton. It was a man, or what used to be a man. He was completely encased in the red fibers, his skin replaced by that same raw, muscular texture. His eyes were wide open, but they weren't human eyes anymore. They were flickering red orbs that pulsed in time with the heartbeat of the forest. The figure's mouth opened, and a sound came out. It wasn't a voice. It was the sound of a radio transmission. Specifically, it was the sound of David's own radio call from 10 minutes ago. It played back his own heavy breathing and the sound of his boots on the moss with perfect digital clarity. Observation number 8. A voice whispered from the dashboard of the truck. It was David's own voice, but it sounded older, more tired, as if it had been speaking for 1,000 years. Subject Thorn has reached the core. Initiation beginning. The trail is complete. David backed away, tripping over a tree root that felt suspiciously like a giant, pulsing artery. He scrambled to his feet and started running. He didn't follow the path. He crashed through the brush, ignoring the thorns that tore at his uniform and the mud that threatened to pull his boots off. He just needed to get away from the red. But as he ran, he realized the red was everywhere. It was in the moss. It was under the bark of every tree. It was even starting to appear on his own hands. Small, thin, red threads were beginning to sprout from under his fingernails, reaching out like tiny tentacles. At exactly asterisk 4:22 p.m., just as the sun was beginning to fail, David saw a flash of blue. It was the trailhead sign for the Hoh River. He burst out of the brush and collapsed onto the gravel. He didn't look back. He didn't check his gear. He jumped into his truck, started the engine, and drove until he reached the nearest hospital in Port Angeles. When the doctors examined him, they found something that made them call the CDC. David was physically fine, except for one thing. His blood chemistry had been completely rewritten. He had gone into the woods as type O positive. He came out with a blood type that didn't match anything in the human record. It was thick, dark, and contained cellular structures that looked more like fungal spores than human blood cells. David Thorne resigned from the Park Service the very next day. He didn't give a reason. He sold his house, packed his things, and moved to the middle of the desert in Arizona, a place where there are no trees, no moss, and certainly no rain. But here's the part that will give you chills. Every year on October 14th, David wakes up at exactly **8:45 a.m. And when he looks in the bathroom mirror, he sees a thin, red line growing across his chest, right over his heart. It doesn't hurt, it doesn't itch, but every year, it gets a little longer, a little thicker, and a little more like the texture of that red ribbon. And if he sits very still in the absolute silence of the desert night, he can hear it, a faint, rhythmic thumping coming from inside his own chest. It isn't his heart. It is the sound of the Olympic forest, 300 miles away, still calling him back to finish the trail. Because the forest isn't just growing trees anymore. It is growing a map, and it is always looking for new muscle to expand its borders. If you are ever hiking in the Pacific Northwest and you see a bright red marker on a trail that isn't on your map, do not follow it. Do not touch it. And for heaven's sake, do not think you are the one doing the exploring, because in the Hoh rainforest, the trail is the one exploring you. Now, you might think the Forest Service just let this go, but in November of **2025**, a specialized team was sent back into the area where David Thorne had reported the red trail. They were equipped with hazmat suits and high-frequency scanners. They found the clearing. They found the truck, Unit 704, but the truck was empty. There was no sign of Elias Vance, and more importantly, there was no sign of the red muscle fibers. The forest looked perfectly normal, just moss, trees, and dirt. However, when they towed the truck back to the lab and opened the engine block, they found that the pistons, the spark plugs, and the cylinder heads had all been replaced by perfectly formed, calcified human bone. The truck wasn't a machine anymore. It was a skeletal remains of a vehicle that had been digested and rebuilt. The Forest Service officially declared the area a permanent high-risk zone and fenced it off, citing unstable soil conditions. But those who know the story of David Thorne know better. They know that the forest is waiting. It is patient. It has all the time in the world to grow its next marker. And the next time someone like David steps off the path, the red ribbon will be waiting to lead them home. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe for more strange, dark, and mysterious content. We post stories like this every single week. Until next time, stay safe out there in the wild. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. Today's story is about a place where the trees don't just grow, they remember. And sometimes, they decide that the best way to preserve a memory is to become the person who made it. This is a story that suggests the missing persons cases in our national parks aren't always about people who died, but people who were simply repurposed by a biology we don't yet understand. The date was May 12th, 2025. The place was a dense, fog-heavy pocket of the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. Now, the Smokies are famous for two things: their incredible misty beauty and the sheer number of people who walk into those woods and are never seen again. It is a place of deep, ancient hollows where the sun barely touches the forest floor. A 49-year-old man named Dr. Arthur Penhaligon was a world-renowned dendrologist. This means he didn't just look at trees. He studied their cellular memory, their chemical communication, and their ancient history. He was a man of cold, hard science. He wasn't interested in the local folklore about spirits or haints in the woods. He was interested in the data. Arthur had a radical theory. He believed that certain ancient groves of pines could act as a biological hard drive, storing chemical data from every creature that passed by them for thousands of years. He believed trees could download the environment. To prove this, he ventured into a no-go zone of the park, a place the local Cherokee legends called the Forest of the Mockingbirds. It was called this not because there were birds there, but because the forest itself was said to mimic the sounds of the people who entered it. At exactly 9:45 a.m., Arthur passed a boundary marker that had been overgrown by a thick gray lichen. It was a rusted Forest Service sign that had been bent in half by some incredible force. The moment he stepped past it, the air changed. It didn't get colder, it got heavier. It smelled intensely of fresh-cut wood and something sharp and metallic, like copper or fresh blood. At exactly 1:30 p.m., Arthur reached a grove of pines that were unlike any he had ever seen in his 20-year career. They were perfectly straight, reaching nearly 200 feet into the air, but they had no needles. Their branches were bare and twisted into shapes that looked disturbingly like human limbs reaching for the sky in a state of permanent panic. The bark wasn't brown or gray. It was a pale, fleshy white. He pulled out his professional equipment to take a core sample. He chose the largest tree in the center of the grove, but as he pressed the sharp steel borer into the trunk, he didn't hear the sound of wood resistance or the crunch of dry bark. He heard a scream. It wasn't a muffled sound or a trick of the wind. It was a high-pitched, agonizing human scream that echoed through the entire grove, causing Arthur to drop his tools in the dirt. He scrambled back, his heart hammering. He looked at the tree, and where he had punctured the surface, a thick, amber-colored sap was oozing out, but it didn't smell like pine resin. It smelled like iron. It smelled like a hospital. It smelled like blood. Arthur tried to rationalize it. He told himself it was just trapped gas escaping a pressurized trunk. But then, the wind began to blow. As the wind moved through the bare, twisted branches, the trees didn't rustle or creak. They wailed. The shape of the branches acted like a massive flute, and the sound coming out was the sound of thousands of voices screaming in unison, men, women, and children. It was a symphony of collective grief. At exactly 4:20 p.m., Arthur realized he was no longer alone in the grove. He looked at a tree 10 feet to his left and saw a face. It wasn't carved into the wood by a hiker. It was emerging from times under times the bark. It was the face of a young woman, her eyes closed, her mouth open in a silent, eternal cry. As he watched, the white bark shifted and stretched like skin, and the face moved. The eyes snapped open. They were made of dark, polished wood, but they followed his every movement. Arthur grabbed his pack and turned to run, but his boots felt like they were stuck in wet cement. He looked down and saw that the pine needles on the forest floor weren't needles at all. They were hair. Long, brown and blonde human hair, millions of strands of it, weaving themselves around his laces and pulling him down toward the roots. The entire forest floor was a carpet of human remains that had been turned into vegetation. He pulled out his survival hatchet and began hacking at the hair, but every time he cut a strand, he heard a sob come from the ground beneath him. At exactly 6:00 p.m., the sun began to set, turning the white trees a blood-red color. That is when the mimicry reached its terrifying peak. One of the trees, the very one he had bored a hole into, began to split down the middle. The bark didn't just crack. It peeled back like a surgical incision. Out of the center of the tree stepped a figure. It was tall, thin, and its skin had the texture of rough, unpolished wood. But the face was Arthur's. It had his glasses. It had his gray beard. It even had the small, jagged mole on his right cheek. The thing stood there, its wooden joints creaking like a heavy door on rusty hinges. It opened its mouth, and Arthur's own voice came out. but it was layered with the sound of snapping twigs and dry leaves. "Thank you for the sample, Arthur," the thing said, its wooden eyes fixed on his. "We needed a new map. We needed a fresh memory to replace the ones that are rotting. You are a very detailed subject." Arthur didn't stay to hear more. He sprinted through the hair on the ground, his boots slipping on the slick, organic carpet. He ignored the screams of the forest floor as he stepped on it. He ran until his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass and wood smoke. He didn't follow a trail because there were no trails left, only the trees that seemed to step aside, shifting their positions when he wasn't looking, to let him deeper into the trap. Every time he looked back, he saw his wooden double walking behind him. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. It was moving with the slow, inevitable growth of a forest. At exactly 9:30 p.m., he saw a light through the fog. It wasn't a flashlight. It was the yellow glow of a remote ranger station on the edge of the no-go zone. He burst through the final line of white trees and collapsed onto the gravel of the parking lot. The transition from soft hair to hard stone felt like a miracle. The Rangers found him at 10:15 p.m. He was catatonic, curled in a fetal position, clutching a handful of what he thought was moss, but was actually a clump of that long, brown hair he had ripped from the ground. They took him to the nearest hospital in Gatlinburg, treating him for severe shock, dehydration, and thousands of tiny lacerations on his legs. But here is the part that will make you never want to go camping again. When the doctors performed a routine X-ray of Arthur's chest to check for internal injuries from his fall, the room went silent. They didn't find lungs. They didn't find a ribcage. Instead, the image showed a complex, dense network of roots and branches where his organs should have been. Arthur Penhaligon was still alive. He was still talking, but his internal biology had been completely rewritten. He was being turned into a tree from the inside out. Arthur vanished from the hospital 3 days later. No one saw him leave. The security footage showed a man in Arthur's hospital gown walking out the front door at exactly 4:22 a.m. But as the man passed under the bright fluorescent lights of the parking lot, his skin didn't reflect the light. It absorbed it, like old, dry bark. And as he walked toward the tree line, his footsteps didn't make a sound on the pavement. If you go to the Great Smoky Mountains today, near the area of the Forest of the Mockingbirds, you might find a white tree that looks a little too much like a man. It won't have any needles. It will just have branches that look like reaching arms, and a small, circular hole in its chest, the exact spot where a core sample was once taken. And if the wind blows just right through those twisted limbs, you might hear a voice. It won't be a scream anymore. It will sound like a calm, educated man, a scientist, explaining the complex biology of the forest to an audience that isn't there. Do not stop to listen. And whatever you do, do not take a sample, because the trees in that grove are very protective of their data, and they are always looking for a new biological hard drive to call home. If you feel a tug on your shoelaces, or if the moss under your feet feels a little too much like hair, do not look down. Just run. Because once the grove has your data, you aren't a person anymore. You are just another memory stored in the wood, waiting for the next hiker to come along and give you a new face. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed this journey into the Forest of the Mockingbirds, please hit the like button and subscribe. We post these strange, dark, and mysterious stories every single week. Until next time, stay on the marked trails and stay safe.